Industrial sector?
Currently, what other options do you have?
Go to Russia and send money back.
Yeah, right? That's not exactly a secure option, especially if the ruble is crashing. So we've got environmental factors, we've got economic factors that drive people to keep doing the farms this way because they don't have other options. We have social factors, right? How can social factors make you more vulnerable? Any thoughts?
I think maybe ineffectiveness of governmental institutions.
Yeah, right. Corruption in your government means that the government isn't as able to respond. It doesn't have the money that it needs, and it doesn't work as well as it needs to work. So yes, on a governmental level, for sure. What about as a society? What social factors might make? Is a whole town or a whole village, is everybody equally as vulnerable to something? To climate change? To an event? No. What could make people more or less vulnerable?
Inequality of
Yeah, inequality of what? Income. Sure, income inequality, right? If you have more wealth, you have more options. Straight up, that's the easiest way to describe it. You are more able to adapt. What do I mean by adapt? Right? Change your way of living, change what you're doing to adjust to the situation. Yeah, so income inequality, what else? Inequality, can you think of any other forms of inequality that exist in a society?
access inequality.
Yeah. Access to goods, which usually comes with wealth, but also access to resources, right? And that cannot just come with wealth, that can come with your ethnicity, that can come with the history, that can come with whether you're a guy or a girl, that can come with age, right? All of those things dictate your access, your status in society. So access inequality and status inequality. All of those things determine who is vulnerable. And I can't say women and children are always more vulnerable, old people are always more vulnerable, because it depends on, exactly as Paul said, what are you talking about? What situation are you talking about? In some situations, men might be more vulnerable. Who's more vulnerable to dying during a war? Definitely not women, right? In some situations, adults might be more vulnerable, or children, or old people. So it changes depending on the situation. Just like your natural environment doesn't necessarily make you more vulnerable, it's what is occurring combined with your natural environment, right, that makes you more vulnerable. You guys will never, ever, ever be vulnerable to a tsunami, right? A tidal wave, a giant wave is never going to hit here because it's not physically possible, because you don't have that coastline. You are, however, vulnerable to a lot of the other impacts of climate change because you do house a lot of the water for the region, and your glaciers are melting. You're a very arid area, and increasing aridization is what's happening here. So there's a number of factors, as was mentioned, that make people vulnerable. The only one I didn't list here, anthropogenic factors. What does that mean? We discussed them already, but I just didn't call them that. What does that mean?
What human?
Yeah, anthropogenic, coming from humans, right? So human activity. So this was a map that you saw last class. So it just shows the increasing aridization and the increasing glacial melt. And since I'm not wearing my glasses, I actually can't read it. Can you tell me what it says? I can guess. But
Yeah. So on the one hand, it shows, like Ellie already said, there's so more, like which area is getting drier, or also affected by drought. Then you also have areas, especially in the mountains, where you have this climate-related hazards, like also landslides, mud flows, resulting from glacier melting. And you also have, in general, like the changes in water flow regime, also due to glacial melting. And I think, yeah, that's more like this.
Those are the main ones affecting this particular region. So we have this breakdown here of what exactly the drivers of vulnerability to climate change. So I call these the factors. The WWF and the World Bank split it up in a slightly different way, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But you'll notice if you look at Tajikistan, it says that the drivers here, the main driver, is sensitivity. You've got a little bit of effect from exposure and some from adaptive capacity. Kyrgyzstan is a very similar situation, less adaptive capacity than Tajikistan, a little bit less sensitivity, but it's still a main driver. You can see here in Turkmenistan, the main problem is sensitivity. Uzbekistan looks very similar. And Kazakhstan has much more adaptive capacity, which is what's actually bringing down the problems of sensitivity and exposure. Right? So adaptive capacity helps you. It's your ability to adapt, right? It helps you reduce your exposure and your sensitivity. So what are exposure and sensitivity?
Yes. I would like to now bring more structure into all the terms. We can say vulnerability, yeah, you mentioned easily affected. Yeah. So we could say actually vulnerability is the potential to be harmed by something. And when you look at this picture, for example, you see their house along a river, yeah, and their house also at a little bit more far away and even higher as the others on the hill. When you have, for example, a flood, you could say that the houses along the river are more vulnerable to get affected by this flood than the houses up on the hill.
But it will depend to what we can think it will be vulnerable to. For example, landslide.
Yes.
Can also affect.
Yes. This is correct. I mean, in this specific example I just mentioned, I just referred to flood. Yeah? Here basically I just brought up this environmental factor as just a geographical point of view, because when you have a flood and they are just located directly at the river, yeah, and probably the flood will not go so high that it reaches even the mountains. So in this specific case, when you have a flood, you can say due to the geography, these houses along the river are more vulnerable to floods than these up there, because they are directly affected by the floods. And then, what we should also distinguish when we talk about vulnerability is that we have, so to say, a hazard. I mean, we a lot already talked about climate change related hazards. And a hazard is actually a situation that can cause harm. Yeah? And in this specific example, again, talking about floods, so you have like heavy precipitation event, thunderstorm, which would lead to a flood. So the flood is then actually the hazard. And then actually an impact is then the resultant damage to property, livelihoods, or ecosystem health caused by a hazard. So in this case, the flood was the hazard, and the houses along the river, they got affected by this flood, and now they are damaged. So this is now the impact resultant from this flood.
So one way, Paul mentioned risk earlier, the idea of risk. One way that a lot of disaster managers think about risk is they think about it as hazard times vulnerability. Not actually as an equation that you're going to plug numbers into, although people have tried. But the idea that the chance of this event, the chance of this hazard occurring, times the damage, the impact that it could do, that tells you what your risk is, right? If there's no damage, then there's no risk. If there's no chance that the thing will occur, like there's no chance of tsunami, there's no risk, right? But if there's a chance that something will occur and there's damage that can occur, what is the most likely damage that will occur from this event? That is your risk level. But the focus right now is on vulnerability and reducing vulnerability, because if you reduce vulnerability, you reduce the chance of something, how much it's going to affect you. You can also possibly reduce the chance of it happening, although good luck with that. And that lowers your risk. So that's why we focus on vulnerability.
Yeah. In order to better understand also now these two, the distinction also between impact and hazard, I would like to do a short quiz for you. Because here you see now different items, and I just want to know from you, do you think a hazard is described or is it an impact?
Is it the hazard, is it the chance or the event that can occur, or is it the effect of the event occurring?
What about loss of wildlife?
Same.
It's in
Why?
when the climate change, it affects on the wildlife, and
Yes.
You can go with it's something that has happened, right? An impact is something.
Yes. What about severe storms?
hazards.
What's different between increasing, what's different between the first one and that one?
Increase severity.
Now very difficult. What about damage to human settlement?
Yes, it's very much so an impact.
Okay. Now I would like to show you two short movies, and you should tell me afterwards why I actually showed you these movies in the context of our discussion.
Godzilla, king of the monsters, alive, surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror to wreak vengeance on mankind. Godzilla, king of the monsters, it's alive, a gigantic beast, stalking the earth, crushing all before it, in a cyclonic cavalcade of electrifying horror, raging through the streets on a rampage of total destruction. Godzilla, king of the monsters, incredible titan of terror, wiping out a city of 6 million in a holocaust of flame. Jet flames cannot destroy it. Bombs cannot kill it. All modern weapons fail. Is this the end of our civilization? Can the scientists of the world find a way to stop this creature? For the answer, see Godzilla, king of the monsters. You may wish to deny it, but your eyes tell you it's true. A tale to stun the mind. More fantastic than any ever written by Jules Verne. More terrifying than any ever shown on the screen. Awesome. Incredible. Unbelievable. A story beyond your wildest dreams. Dynamic violence. Savage action. Spectacular thrill. Godzilla, king of the monsters. Fantastic beyond comprehension. Gripping beyond compare. Astounding beyond belief. The mightiest monster of them all. See Godzilla, king of the monsters.
Can I say that in both cases we see the Godzilla and the blob, yes, and they are causing the severe damages to human around that surround them. And the connection to the climate change is that even though those Godzillas and the blobs do not exist in real world, but it represents, for example, some factors that really affect a human. For example, it could be earthquake, typhoon, tsunami or whatever else that would cause.
And this could be Godzilla. And what do you think could be then the block?
Human.
In terms of impact now, the resulting damage.
Some human activity that caused this.
Other people saw.
So the block was moving out of the screen of the scene, right?
It was written, it crawls, yeah? So run fast, don't walk.
So something that humans created and then it affected. I don't know.
Maybe they are pumping something and kind of building something, industrialization, which will lead to so people will survive and they will continue their society.
Okay, then I help you a little bit. As I said, okay, there could be hazards related to climate change which lead to very destructive impacts. Yeah, this is Godzilla. It comes and destroys, and people are highly affected, and they feel it immediately. Yeah? And then you have more the blob, which crawls. Yeah? This is also related to this, we call this slow onset of climate change. That people, in the beginning, they don't really feel that there might be an impact later resulting from a hazard. So for example, in the Pile region where we work, the people are highly dependent on water coming down from glaciers. At the moment, they do not have the perception, they do not really perceive that there might be in the future a problem, because the glacier still exists, and they still get water running down from the glacier. But climate change is happening and glaciers are melting, and maybe even in the beginning they have more water, but then at a certain point there's this tipping point that there will be no water anymore, and then they actually have also an impact, because all the water they have been dependent on is gone. So this is actually the slow crawling impact which could only happen in the future. So you don't feel it at the moment, but slowly it comes, and then it also as severe as before the very destructive immediate impact from the Godzilla. Is this more or less clear? Okay, then quickly, because we actually want to do still this setting review and time's running a little bit. There's also this more technical definition of vulnerability. And you saw already in this one figure there was vulnerability distinguished in exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. And we also shortly mentioned a little bit what actually these factors mean. But just also quickly to give you the exact definitions. So when we talk about exposure, so to being exposed to something, so exposure means the degree to which something experiences a climate-related hazard. And Ellie already mentioned, so when we look now here, for example, at Bishkek and here at an island in the Pacific Ocean, who is more exposed to sea level rise? The island. Why?
Because the glaciers are melting, the water level will rise, then it will disappear.
The more simple reason, what factor?
Yeah. So when we talk about sea level rise, why is Bishkek not exposed to sea level rise?
You don't have sea.
Yes. You're also correct, but
Yeah. Then we have the term sensitivity, so the degree of impact that the hazard can have on something. I will also later give an example. And then we have adaptive capacity. This is actually then the ability that you can proactively do something to reduce your vulnerability, so to modify the conditions. And here you see two examples. So here we have a rather poor village, also directly located at a river. Yeah, they have boats, but in very poor conditions. And then you have a village which is also located along the river, but they have probably houses on stilts. They also have good access to information, or they even might have an early warning system to get informed in advance when there might be a flood is coming. So taking these two examples, who do you think has a higher adaptive capacity?
The second one,
Why?
because the access to information.
Right, they can call for help, they can research aid solutions. So you can see how these all, if you look at these factors, how they're connected, right? Your exposure, whether or not the event can happen to you. Your sensitivity, how badly that event will actually affect you, right? Maybe you're not very sensitive. If there's a flood, you live high on the mountain, not going to affect you. You live right next to it, going to affect you. Those things make you more vulnerable. Your adaptive capacity makes you less vulnerable, right? If you're richer like Kazakhstan, you have more resources at your disposal to respond to an event or try and adapt earlier. If you have higher social status or economic status, or you're less corrupt politically, right? You have the resources available to you to adapt. When you don't have those resources available, you are more vulnerable.
Maybe once more simplified. So when we look at these factors, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and when we take the analogy of boxing, you could say exposure is the number of times you are punched. And sensitivity is then when you are punched, so how much does this punch hurt? And adaptive capacity is then how quickly you can move out of the way. So probably a young boxer has higher adaptive capacity than an older one.
Or maybe you will say, oh, it's okay to be hit.
Or maybe he won't know how to move. Right? Old people can be adaptive too.
And these three factors then, exposure, sensitivity, and so the lack of adaptive capacity, this is then the vulnerability. And just quickly one more example, because the other one was too simple. I'm taking Bishkek in the island in the Pacific Ocean, but now taking the small island here and Great Britain. And what do you think, which island is now more vulnerable to sea level rise?
The second one.
Think about which one has more exposure?
So we can start with exposure. So which of these islands is more exposed to, let's say, 1 meter sea level rise?
So who's more vulnerable? First one, right? So yes, you're correct when you looked at it immediately, but you have to think about why.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, so basically Great Britain, due to the long coastline, it's highly exposed, but of course has low sensitivity and high adaptive capacity. And in total, the small island is much more vulnerable because it has low exposure, but is highly sensitive and has low adaptive capacity. Step by step. Yeah.
So think about the exposure, then think about the sensitivity, then think about the adaptive capacity to get your.
Yeah. And regarding exposure, you have here these 3 villages. Village A, located along a river, but the houses are on stilts, for example, you see. Then you have here village B, in the mountains, steep slopes. And you have village C, also located in the valley along the river. And when we look at exposure and think about these climate change-related hazards, because floods and landslides, of course, are results or effects of heavy precipitation events. And in the case of village A, so you have heavy rains once every 3 years. And for village B and C, you have heavy rains 3 times per year.
Yeah, so look carefully at the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity written on your sheet, and use that to decide whether or not you should be giving it a high, medium, low, or not applicable ranking.
Yes, the accreditation factors, that high income, large landowners, that extend access to information.
What do you think it's about then? Paul is saying it's not about absolute value, so what is it about?
Meaning.
What do you mean by meaning? What do you mean? I don't understand your meaning.
How much is about risky?
It depends on geographical position of each village.
Okay.
If they are access to information, their incomes.
Okay, so we know that. We already know that. You said, Paul said it's not about specific numbers, and you said, or not about specific values, and you said it's not about numbers. Then what is the point of this exercise? In real life, if you took this out to a village, what would be the point of this exercise?
Cost benefit
That does have to be involved.
Different perspectives.
Yeah.
And where we should live.
Where we should live
How
and how we should adapt.
I mean, it's a matter of comparison when we compare
Yeah.
one thing to another.
So the numbers do allow us to compare, for sure. They give us a solid thing for comparison.
So where to live and how base.
If you already live in the place and you're doing the vulnerability assessment, what would the point be? If you already live in Bishkek and you are doing a vulnerability assessment of Bishkek, or you already live in the 12th microdistrict and you are doing a vulnerability assessment of the 12th microdistrict, what is the point? And what can you do to increase your adaptive capacity, right? So it's about that discussion and figuring out where the problem is. This is to help you target the problems so that you can reduce vulnerability. So what did you guys get?
So let's see.
You have two groups, just tell us
Do you have the right answer?
right answer. Is there a right answer? Is there some?
Village A is not exposed to floods a lot because the frequency of heavy rains is low
Okay.
compared to other villages.
You know, okay, sure.
We gave 2 because the village 80 is located very close to the river. That's one.
Okay. Right, so you can see how there's a debate here, right? Is it low or high? Is once in every 3 years a frequent rainfall or an infrequent rainfall? How close are they to the river? Is that very close to the river or only kind of close to the river, right? You can see how that's a discussion where you need a variety of perspectives. What about landslides? What did you give Village A?
1.
1.
Really? They're up on the opposite side of the river from a mountain. Do they have any exposure to landslides?
Well, basically, no, but
No, don't be afraid to give them a 0, right? You could make the argument maybe the land will fall in the river and the river will somehow splash. I don't know. Or you could make some crazy argument. Fine.
That's what.
That was a good argument.
That was their argument.
and also since it's close to the river, it's also exposed to the landslide because maybe it will.
It's not a landslide, but it's because the landslide is on an incline, but it
I
could.
think he's saying if the landslide is big enough, it can travel
Well,
further
yeah.
across the river. I've seen that.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking what is that called? Land? Oh no. Can't remember words in English now. Okay, what did you give Village A for sensitivity to floods?
2.
2.
Compare Village A to Village B. Who is more sensitive? What happens to Village A? What happens to the houses in Village A if it floods?
They get destroyed.
Really? Look at those houses.
You know what still is there? The houses are related to this for
So compared to Village C, right? What's going to happen to those houses if the river overflows its banks?
Sorry,
To Village C, what's gonna happen to those houses if the river overflows its banks?
It's too sensitive.
Yeah, it's much more sensitive. Those houses are gone, or at least full of water.
What's the reason of sandy soil?
What happens to sandy soil when it gets wet?
It just disappears like it's not stable. Like you cannot build a stable thing on sand.
Yeah, it's very movable, right? So it becomes mud, it sucks things down, and it also shifts. So the bases of the houses are gonna shift. So the houses are gonna basically be ripped out from, goes down. Right, yeah. I don't think they're gonna be, they could be exposed to flash flooding. I don't, not seeing the layout of this mountain.
In this context, the rain triggers the landslide.
Yeah, the rain triggers the landslide. Maybe they could be exposed to flash flooding, but based on what I'm seeing, I'm gonna say they're more exposed, like they're very exposed to landslides. Or 3 times per year, yeah. Very exposed to landslides, right? But how exposed are they to flooding? 1, maybe, at maximum. The water's not gonna stay there. Yeah, well, as a human, I'm vulnerable to hunger. So thanks for sticking around with us a little later today. Hopefully it was useful.